Hello and welcome to YAGR, your one-stop shop for high-quality game reviews. Today we'll be doing our final verdict on Sudden Strike 4 by Calypso Media Publishers. So, the first thing I want to note is our playthrough team has put in just about 10 hours in this game. And we feel like for the past 4 to 6 hours of those 10 hours, we've already seen everything the game has to offer, which is a pretty major issue, but we'll get into more detail in that later. First, we'll talk about art and graphics. So, some of the things that Sudden Strike does well with art and graphics is the map is reasonably well detailed, the vehicles and soldiers are fairly easy to determine the type and structure of them from the distance of the camera that you're typically going to be playing at. Everything is presented in a reasonably clear manner where you can distinguish them even though you're not very close up with your camera. Overall, art and graphics are appeasing, the maps are graphically believable, they look like realistic, real places within the world that the war would have been conducted in. There's indications of previous battles fought on the field. It's all pretty cool, believable, and has an element of realism to it that they've tried to put in through the whole game. So that's pretty attractive. And then you also have the effects of explosions, tank shells, artillery hitting the ground, gunfire, things like that. It's all done pretty well. The game doesn't look bad. But one of the serious complaints we had, these are the cons of the art and graphics, is that you can tell the type difference within them, meaning you can tell a light tank from a medium tank from a heavy tank. But what you can't tell is the kinds of tanks. So, like, I know I have a couple heavy tanks and a couple light tanks, but there's more than one type of heavy tank and one type of light tank, and they all have different minor nuances with regards to stats such as range, damage, armor penetration, things like that. I can't really tell, based on how they've been graphically represented, which one is which. And there's no kind of like extra icons helping establish which is what and things like that. So the representation of what units you actually have available to you from a visual standpoint outside of the small little quick bars where it shows your unit selection at the bottom is poorly done. I can't just look at the screen and know what I have at my disposal. I can know what kind of things I have, but I don't have a very good specific drill down of the elements and units I have to progress forward. And in a game like this where it gives you a very limited amount of resources to complete sometimes very challenging levels, you need to know that at a quick cursory glance, especially in the multiplayer where there's no pause function. You need to be able to assess what you have and move on with it. Particularly the anti-tank systems, a lot of them look extremely similar but operate completely differently. I think this could have been mitigated in a few different ways, one of which being have unit symbols and elements maybe next to the little flag that shows the control group, and that might have helped mitigate it, because there are actual military doctrinal symbols for those kinds of things. And that would have added a cool level of realism and meshed it with real-world scenario and situation pretty well, and it would have been simple because it's a static graphic that you're adding to the game, but it was just overlooked. Maybe it wasn't thought of, but I think that would have been helpful on a large degree from a graphics and art standpoint. Otherwise, nothing serious to complain about in that regard. Next, we're going to talk about sound. Pros for sound, pretty solid. The different vehicle types and the different weapon types have excellent sound that is pretty reflective of what they would actually sound like, outside of maybe the rocket artillery and things like that. It sounds a little campy and gamey, but I'm not going to expect them to go out and record an actual rocket launch for the game, so frankly I think it's just fine. Some of the voice lines are okay, the voice acting is average at best, and we're kind of getting into the cons for sound design here. Like I said, the voice acting's only average. it's really choppy delivered lines. It's kind of like I would have rather just read it than had it poorly delivered to me, I guess. But that might be a personal opinion. Another thing that got really annoying over time was the unit sounds, specifically the little quips that they give you when you tell them to move or something like that. I understand that it's helpful because it provides an audio recognition confirming that you gave them the command. But the problem I have with it is there's such a tiny sound bank, and it's only one voice saying the thing, and they'll repeat the same phrase over and over and over as you give them a command. Not to get into the comparative analysis, but when you look at a game, an RTS, like, say, StarCraft, and you're moving around units, they've got like 5 or 6 lines to say when you're giving them commands. Now, if you're rapidly right-clicking, it's going to get annoying, but when you move the same group of units, 30-second difference between each other, you're going to get a different line. It's not repetitive drilling into your ears. And when you only have a specific set number of units, you're going to be moving those same units quite a bit, especially because that's really the biggest level of tactics within the game, which we'll get into later. So the amount of voice lines for units and things like that kind of got a little annoying. It's a pretty minor complaint, but it's there. The narrators, like I said, their voice lines are pretty poorly delivered overall. Not only that, but the narrator, I think, is roughly the same guy for the German, Russian, and I believe it was US or British campaign. It's literally the same voice, even though these are very different people and very different cultures. Like, they could have at least tried to make a decent accent, or maybe gotten someone with even just a different voice, because they speak to you in whatever language you select in the options, regardless of what faction you're playing. But they could have at least done a different English voice just to help differentiate that, but they didn't go through that. I mean, I guess maybe it saved them some money on the back end, but it seems like something pretty simple they could have done, especially with the quality of delivery on the lines. They could have gotten one of their programmers or something to say the lines, and it probably would have been roughly the same quality as what the final thing is. So I don't really think there's a good excuse for that. I think that was just kind of a choice that they tossed in there. But I understand that there's a reasonable amount of focus on the multiplayer in this because the campaign doesn't have terribly much replayability, but they added a little bit to it, and we'll get into that later. So that covers art and sound. The next thing we're going to go into is the actual tactical gameplay of Sudden Strike 4. First, we're going to cover what they did well. What they did well is they made the counter chess-like feeling where certain units are excellent at fighting other units. They made that feeling very powerful. So there's a clear strategic goal of I want to move my tanks against this infantry, I want to move my anti-tank against their tank, and I want to move my infantry against their anti-tank systems. And then everything blows up artillery because it's high priority. That is very ingrained, very obvious, and very apparent from the beginning of the game, and they did a good job with that. There's significant damage bonuses for using the right thing against the other thing. I think that's great, and it very much emphasizes the reality of the situation in a case like this. So that was well done. Also, the flanking system, the increased amount of damage you get from hitting from the side or back, not only against tanks, but also on things like anti-tank systems, anti-air systems that are built to have that shield for the men manning them. It actually feels like that's extremely impactful, and you want to get around that to try and remove it from its position. I think that's great, and they did an excellent job emphasizing and integrating that, so that was well done as well. Also, from a tactical standpoint, the dependence on having to use troop transport to keep your infantry relevant within the game if you're on the offense, as well as being able to tow your anti-tank systems, is a nice touch. A lot of times people might just magically pop in a vehicle and then the anti-tank is getting pulled away. This game, you actually have to manage and use the systems together to make that work. And that's pretty nice. That's a nice touch of realism they've added. There's a big focus on trying to make everything seem the way it actually would function. Whether that was overall successful or not is going to be on a case-by-case basis and heavily opinionated, so I won't make the final verdict on that. But I will tell you, they tried very hard to make that the case, and from our perspective here at YAGR, they did a pretty good job of that. Now some of the downsides of the tactics and gameplay within Sudden Strike 4. It's interesting for a little bit, because yes, your positioning matters very much, and you very much feel like when you're on the defensive you have a strong advantage, which is extremely true in real life warfare. If you're on a defensive position and you've had time to set up, you are going to be very strong. It's hard to break a defense. And when you're pushing through and breaking multiple defensive lines and you see your numbers dwindle, like you do in this game, that's an accurate representation. But also, there's some serious degree of challenge because of that limited level of resources. The game does an okay job providing you with reinforcements, and I'm speaking in the campaign sense specifically. Providing you with reinforcements at a specific period in time and providing a decent composition of those reinforcements. However, some of the things it asks you to do can be very challenging, especially for inexperienced or just your average run-of-the-mill RTS player. And that challenge doesn't necessarily come from the game being challenging and tactically sound and strategic. It comes more from having that limited amount of resources and not having a lot of functionality and responsiveness within those units. You have a certain degree of control and a few pre-made formations that you can choose to use when you go out and tell groups of units to move somewhere. But the issue with that is a lot of times they're not particularly intelligent, as you can see on the screen right now. They're driving into each other and trying to figure out, how do I get to that one specific spot? And eventually they either make it or give up. And this really wastes time and blocks other elements. So the AI not being smart in achieving the positions that they're going for, as well as some just blatantly unrealistic scenarios that, for a game that's really trying to push the realism factor, it's kind of odd that they did this. Tanks will drive over bunkers and infantrymen and nothing will happen just to get to their position. I understand that to a degree there has to be a gaming effect to it, but you can't cherry pick it. If your tanks can drive over infantry, then they should be able to somehow shift the entire element so that you can get the formation you want. You can't say it works with this but not with that, because then you start getting the scenarios where you have a tank turning 180 degrees for no reason because it can't move through your supply truck, but then it drives over 30 infantrymen and you're like, that what? It's just it breaks. There's some sort of disjoint there that I'm really not a fan of. So that's part of my issue with the gameplay of it. Another issue I have with the gameplay is a certain element of it is based on your line of sight and what you can see and what you can call back and have your other elements shoot, which is reasonable enough, but there's some serious discrepancies between what vehicles can see versus what infantry can see. And again, this has a degree of realism to it, but the level of discrepancy between what a foot soldier can see versus what someone sitting in the front of a truck can see is a little excessive. And also, the area being revealed from the fog of war, the kind of like radius of light around the unit, it doesn't move smoothly across the map as you reveal new areas. It's very choppy, and sometimes that can lead to a delay in when you would see an element, and it could result in you losing some extra units that you have a very limited number of because of that artificial delay in the way it reveals the map. So that's another issue with the gameplay. Also, it just feels like there's not much you can do outside of move and tell them where to shoot, and then attempt to position intelligently, but even so, it seems like that only gets you so far. You can try to position from defilade with your artillery and bring your tanks around in a tactical manner and then move your infantry up in small squads, but the degree of control required to do that is on a very advanced level of play, and also with only 9 control groups that don't really mesh well, and you'd have to spend more time building appropriate control groups of combinations of armor, infantry, and artillery to make it the kind of perfect storm, if you will. The amount of time to do that is going to extend past the amount of time it would take to finish the level if you just blitz the whole thing. At least in some cases. So there's an emphasis on strategy that falls to the wayside because of a lack of specific unit control and easy formations and tactics, and that just comes down to not enough complexity in the functions you can get your units to do. If you're an extremely advanced player in RTS, I'm sure you can get what you want out of the game, but that is requesting a serious level of commitment to a game that just doesn't feel like it's worth putting that much time into, sadly. It's fun to get one playthrough in, and if you're into challenges, there's some interesting sounding challenges that really play around the limited number of units you have. And if you're super into multiplayer, then maybe you can find a niche in this game, but the fairly simplistic and common gameplay mechanics are pretty detrimental overall to the experience of the game from what we felt at YAGR. Without ripping too hard on that, I think I'm going to leave it there for gameplay and tactics. And just know, if you're interested in picking up Sudden Strike, we all know the story, and the tactics and strategy are kind of basic unless you're able to really push the system with advanced skills and play. So the next thing we're going to go over is pacing of the game. So the good thing about the pacing of the game is, again, it's fairly close to realism. You're going to feel ups and downs with the pacing of any given level, and also the progression of difficulty through a campaign story. That progression pacing is done pretty well. It's got a couple easy things, and then it gets a little tougher, and then it starts getting really challenging for a bit. And that's solid. I think that pacing is okay. It's fine. I was kind of surprised at the challenge spike at one point, but having that increase in challenge makes you try to make the system do more than it initially seems it can. So it's not necessarily an issue. Just expect to be challenged, as a video game should do. It should challenge you. That way you feel good when you get past the challenge spike, if you will. But where the pacing falls to the wayside is, like I said earlier in this review, we have a certain level of expectation for gameisms. We want to be entertained when we play games. And one of the things that isn't very entertaining when you play games is sitting there and waiting for stuff to happen. What I'm specifically referring to in the case of Sudden Strike 4 is your resupply and repair vehicles. Now, this makes a lot of sense, and again, it hits on a level of realism because there is very much a lot of hurry up and wait in scenarios like this, especially when you have very expensive, very important limited resources. You need to make sure those things can last you as long as possible, and that makes lots of sense. But that doesn't mean I want to experience it in my game. I want to sit down and I want to enjoy actual gameplay. I don't want to sit there and watch my resupply truck load rockets into my multiple rocket launcher. Now, this long resupply and repair system for these powerful units clearly has an important place in multiplayer, extremely important. Because if you want to try and be competitive, those are going to be important factors to take into consideration. If you can tell when he's resupplying those heavy units that take a while to resupply, that's a perfect time to counterattack. So there's clearly a place for it, but you didn't have to make it that way in the single player where nothing else is going on. Because in a lot of times, like the level you're watching now, your multiple rocket launchers are the most important asset you have. And you have two of them, and you have a bunch of supply trucks, so you need to keep resupplying them so that you can soften the battlefield before you move forward and take the objective. Sitting there, watching the ammo go up by one every 15 seconds when they have like a 30-40 round capacity is really boring. But you can't move your infantry in because you've already lost half of them because they're your key system for taking out anti-tank, and you're going to take attrition. And you can't send your tanks in because there's anti-tanks sitting in there and it'll blow up your heavy tanks in 3 shots. You have to wait for your artillery to resupply. So you are resigned to sitting there for upwards of, in some cases, a minute or more while your artillery resupplies with nothing to do. You can't even arguably scout out new areas because the system tells you exactly where you need to go. So there's no point in scouting things out. Not only that, you'll probably just lose more units that you're not ever going to get replaced in the level. So there's these cool peaks of action where you're pushing your tanks forward and flanking with your infantry and commanding your artillery to strike strategic targets. And it feels really exciting, and in some cases and levels, you're moving on multiple battlefronts at once, particularly in the German campaign. And it's really exciting and interesting. And then you have these huge valleys of sitting there, waiting for reinforcements to pull up, waiting for your resupply truck to refill your tanks with tank rounds, waiting for your repair truck to drive halfway across the map because you need to keep it safe because you're not going to get replacement tanks in order to fix the treads on a tank so you can move to the next objective. And you just sit there. You sit there for so long. In fact, in the recording you're watching, anytime that's occurring, I have sped up the video and audio so that you don't have to sit there and watch nothing. But every level, there's a reasonable portion of it where this happens. Which, again, for a competitive multiplayer experience, I understand the importance of that. From a realism aspect, I understand the importance of that. From a single player enjoying a game perspective, if you're not into it for the realism, it's a ball ache. It's not fun sitting there watching your dudes literally do nothing but increase a number on an arbitrary chart. It kills the pacing of the game. It is painstakingly slow and boring to watch it happen, but it is an integral part of the game, and you can't avoid it. So, it's a bit of a struggle there, and I think that is one of the glaring issues with pacing. Frankly, I think it's such a serious issue with pacing that that's all I'm going to say about pacing, because there's some other minor gripes as well as minor compliments, but frankly, that point is so important that I want to leave that as the one thing resting in the air. Next, we're going to go over unit control. I had mentioned a little bit about unit control before, and some of the things they did well with unit control is I love the dynamic formation that you can try to set up at the end of a move command. I think that's really neat, and they did a pretty solid job of it. Basically, you can get a column effect, you can get grouping effect, and it'll even try to smart group it so that you don't have all of the same stuff clumped together. There's a bit of a mixture of elements because that's effective and helpful. So it's a dynamic, smart formation system for the end of moves, and I think they did a good job with that. It works reasonably well outside of the AI struggling to get in the correct position sometimes, as well as blocking each other. But ultimately, it never hindered me, and frankly, it probably helped quite a bit because it made sure the heavy tank was in front to take the brunt of the hits if I did a column, or it helped with the grouping because it paired some things together that I didn't think of being effective together, stuff like that. So, I think that was done pretty well. I like that system, and I think more games could benefit from that because you can kind of give more complex processes at a faster rate. So I think that's really helpful, and it was excellent. But one of the issues I have with unit control is, and this kind of falls with unit and camera control, we'll say, is your camera can't zoom out further than this, and you can't set saved camera positions that at least the game never teaches you how to do that. If it's actually a function in the game, that's good, and I will be the first to admit that I was wrong if someone can show me that, but the game never taught you how to do it, and that's an extremely helpful function in RTSs at any level of play if you can pick up how to do it. So, camera control there, and then unit control. I've already went over this in my first impressions, and it most certainly has not changed. There's some degree lacking within the unit selection method and the quick group formations. It's just not enough. I don't know if it's because it's not crisp enough or intuitive enough or complex enough within its reasoning, but these huge disparity in use and importance between the types of units, and then the fact that you can't quickly select and form groups that are conglomerates of the different types of units that function well together. The fact that you have to sit there and spend time making those control groups before moving out and delaying and slowing the pace of the game down even further is detrimental, to say the least. It's nice because you can move all of your armor at once, all of your artillery at once, and all of your infantry at once, and frankly that's probably what you're going to be doing for most of the levels, is just grouping those three things. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, in a real life scenario or in a game, the best thing to do is to have a fusion of all of the things in any given element. You're going to want a little bit of armor and a little bit of infantry to function together when moving forward, and then each of those elements is going to want artillery support available to them as well as specific support units. To some degree, having a realistic feeling of them being separate elements of this is an armor company or platoon, this is an infantry company or platoon, etc. That's interesting and cool, but from a competitive standpoint as well as a casual enjoying the game standpoint, the functionality is not strong enough within any one of these elements to make doing that a smart choice. It works because it's a game, and you can just move huge swaths of infantry that are a mess to micro forward, but the problem with that is then you're going to lose all your medics unless you properly grouped your medics with your support element and then provided them with a security team and maybe one armor element to protect. You see what I'm getting at? You have to like drill down so hard into the details, and there's no system to help you drill down that way to get the proper feeling out of the game. And because of the lack of that system, it damages the pacing, it damages the strategic feel of the game, it damages the smoothness of controlling your units, and not to mention the AI issue we discussed before in regards to units. That doesn't just maintain itself in regards to positioning of vehicles at the end of a move. Moving through enemy units or around obstacles on the map, they still get bugged out and do weird 80-point turns to get around a corner that you could literally just drive over in real life. And I don't know if that should fall under map detail, unit control, or some other type of field or explanation, but it's coming out now, and that's the way we feel about it at YAGR. So, without riffing on it too much, that's pretty much our strongest feelings about Sudden Strike 4. So, in a quick summary, the art in the game is good. It could have been a little bit more specific to help you understand things at a glance when you're looking at the screen, but overall it's a nice looking game. It's also a nice sounding game when it comes to sound design. There's a little bit of unrealism, but I think that's more from a practical sense than anything like that when it comes to sound, and I don't think it's a major issue. The game's got a decent soundtrack, it's got good sound bites, just some of the voice lines aren't the best and also are fairly repetitive. Then we have pacing of the game, which it's got really cool moments in it, but it's dragged down by these huge moments of slow, just doing nothing and watching units spin around and reload ammo and things like that. And it really, really kills the feel of the game sometimes. But it does have an important competitive multiplayer position to be held, so I understand that's unavoidable. However, they could have made some different design choices so that it wasn't the case in single player, but was in multiplayer. Next, we discuss tactical and strategic gameplay, to which there is some lower level of tactics and strategic play involved in the game, especially with the way units complement each other and synergize. That was done well and represented well throughout the entirety of Sudden Strike 4, and they should be commended on that. However, outside of those synergies and the flanking system, which we already discussed at length, there's not a lot else going on tactically. The terrain doesn't matter as much as it should. The structures and functions of things on the map don't matter as much as they should. And the choices you make as the commander only feel like they matter to a very specific degree. So the tactical and strategic play really takes a lot of effort on the player's part and a lot of skill and advanced understanding of things on the player's part in order to get that feel of high-level gameplay. And from a casual position, it's just going to feel kind of like a point-and-click-and-shoot system, which is okay, but doesn't provide a lot of additional value to the game. So that's a little bit of a concern. And finally, we talked a little bit about unit and camera control. And the best thing about the unit and camera control, and arguably one of the best designed things about the game, is the formations that you can kind of quick build at the end of a move, and you can see how they're going to play out. Those were really cool, and I'd love to see more games start incorporating systems like that, because that can have a significant impact on how well a defense or an attack goes based on what your units know they're supposed to do when they get to where they're supposed to be. And I thought that was really cool, concise, and quick way to slap that in there. And I definitely felt the effects and helpfulness of it. Being able to change between a column versus a firing line for armor or soldiers or things like that. It was really cool effect, and it was excellently integrated into the game. So well done there. But the problem with the unit control and things like that overall is it's just kind of clunky and sloppy. It's hard to get the level of detail that is needed to create the advanced feeling that this game is trying to make. And that combined with the already struggling level of pacing within the game causes serious problems. So if maybe only one of those two things was a problem, it wouldn't feel as bad. But right now in Sudden Strike 4, you feel like you don't have enough to do with your units unless you spend an unreasonable amount of time designing your elements and hotkeys for your quick groups. And some advanced players aren't going to have a problem with that because they're used to it and they know it's important and it's worth the time you put into it if you're taking the game seriously. But players who just want to experience a World War II RTS with some pretty nice looking maps and cool units and decent design in these other areas are going to find themselves sitting there either bored if they try to do it because they're just grouping and clicking and moving 5 feet to the left or right so they can box and assign. So they're either going to get bored and frustrated with that, or they're just going to throw everything at the enemy and be like, oh, look, I won anyway. Or, oh, I guess I lost. I'll just go back in and then send these guys up the right side of the map instead of the left and see if that works. So I guess what YAGR was hoping for out of Sudden Strike 4 was a deeper degree of complexity that provides a really interesting level of strategic and tactical play in the game. And what we got was a run-of-the-mill RTS that does the basic things reasonably well, misses out on other basic things, and has some cool little nuanced features, but not enough to remain interesting for a long period of time. So I guess our final recommendation on Sudden Strike 4 is it's certainly not a bad game, but it's definitely not a good game, in our opinion, either. It's okay. It's generic. It's run-of-the-mill. It does some neat little things, but it lacks a level of complexity that is going to drive players to continually play it unless they're diehard fans of the series, or find something that they personally like about the game, which there's plenty of things that you may find about this game. But my biggest issue is it's not worth the $45 to $50 unless you absolutely love multiplayer. There's very limited replayability and there's very limited detail and complexity in what you can do per level. So us at YAGR cannot recommend picking up this game unless you are really, really into this genre of World War II RTS or have some other compelling reason to pick it up. It's just, there's other things on the market that do it better, and they teach you RTS better. But maybe if the price dropped to around like a $25 US range, I could see that being reasonable to pick it up. It's not a bad game, but it's definitely not a $45 to $50 game. So that's pretty much where we sit and feel about Sudden Strike 4. Take it with a grain of salt. If you're interested in it, pick it up for 2 hours on Steam, check it out, and then refund it if you didn't like it. That's always a great option. But outside of that, this has been YAGR with your final verdict on Sudden Strike 4 by Calypso Media Publishers. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online soon.